Alexandria, 1954. The young man standing in line to buy movie tickets looked like any other young Egyptian, at least until his pants exploded. It sounds like the opening to a joke, but it was deadly serious, because the young man was carrying out an Israeli operation so reckless and humiliating that the government tried to bury it for decades. An Israeli military intelligence unit ordered a cell of barely trained Egyptian Jews on a dangerous mission behind enemy lines. Their orders? Set off small explosive charges in empty post offices, cinemas, and railways in Egypt. Then blamed the attacks on local radicals, destabilizing the regime from within. If everything went right, no one would get hurt. But the mission was doomed from the start. The cell was compromised, run by a double agent who had been turned by the Egyptians. He abandoned his comrades to suffer the brutal interrogations and harsh justice of the Egyptian court. Rumors swirled in Israel about some vague, failed operation in Egypt, but the government remained tight-lipped. For years, Israeli citizens were left to read between the cryptic headlines that their leaders refused to explain, but the truth has a way of coming out eventually, and the bitter consequences haunted Israel for decades. So, how did this Israeli spy mission go so terribly wrong? Many of Israel's most daring operations sound like they were lifted from a thrilling but absurd spy film. Who comes up with ideas like, let's infiltrate enemy territory while dressed in drag, or let's assassinate a target using toothpaste, or let's sell exploding beepers to Hezbollah, then wait years to detonate them? But truth is stranger than fiction, and absurd stunts get results. In Israel's early years, its 3 newborn intelligence agencies would try almost anything to protect the state. Israel was surrounded by enemies, and its biggest, most powerful neighbor had nearly 50 times the landmass, 15 times the population, and a chokehold on one of the world's most important shipping routes. The Suez Canal was supposed to be open to everyone, but no one could stop Egypt from barring Israeli ships and harassing any vessel traveling to or from the Jewish state. Not even the 80,000 British troops stationed along the canal zone. Technically, Egypt was independent, but behind the scenes, for decades the Brits controlled everything. But the new Egyptian leader was over it. When Gamal Abdel Nasser became president in 1954, his first priority was getting the Brits to leave. And the Brits, it turned out, were just fine with that. The country was no longer safe for them. British soldiers were tired of living behind barbed wire, hiding from the sniper fire and grenades of Egyptian nationalists. But if the Brits were relieved to be pulling out of Egypt, the Israelis were deeply alarmed by the prospect. Back in 1954, the Jewish state was not the military and technological powerhouse it is today. It was a tiny, desperately poor country that could barely feed and house the hundreds of thousands of immigrants and refugees that kept showing up, desperate at its borders. A steady stream of Arab infiltrators from Gaza and the West Bank had already claimed hundreds of Israeli lives, and the Israeli military was under-equipped with no dedicated arms suppliers. The Brits hadn't exactly protected Israeli trading interests in the Suez Canal, but they were the only power stopping Egypt from invading the Jewish state. And Israeli leaders were terrified about what would happen when the British left. But the Israeli government had a trick up its sleeve. Even before Nasser came to power, military intelligence agents had established sleeper cells in Cairo and Alexandria, made up of young, idealistic Egyptian Jews eager to serve the Jewish state however they could. They had learned how to collect information, how to send coded transmissions, and identify potential targets for sabotage, even how to make incendiary devices. It was time to put that training into practice. It was time to activate the cells. There was just one tiny little problem. Their big mission was completely absurd. It went something like this. Working together, the cells would target British and American sites in Egypt's major cities, sowing chaos and uncertainty. Everyone would assume the sabotage was the work of extremist groups, like the Muslim Brotherhood or the Communists, who were a pain in the neck for the Egyptian government. The Brits would see this unrest and get nervous about President Nasser's ability to keep the peace and protect the canal, and think twice about leaving. And if you're like, that sounds like a really bad plan, well, you are correct. But the terrible plan was just the tip of the iceberg. The cells had no idea what they were doing. Their very basic training hadn't included important topics like what to do in case you're caught. They had no cover stories and no escape routes or safe houses to flee to if the mission went south. They were completely unprepared to withstand the vicious interrogations of the Egyptian police. which was kinda short-sighted considering that the police were onto the cell even before they were recruited. That's because Israeli military intelligence had chosen the most obvious agents imaginable. They had simply waltzed into a Zionist youth group meeting and recruited the most promising candidates, which sounds logical until you remember that Zionist activity was literally a crime in Egypt. All Jews were suspects, subject to surveillance, harassment, arrest, and deportation, especially members of a Zionist youth group, most of whom already knew one another. Rule number 1 in recruiting undercover agents: don't recruit a bunch of friends who travel in the same social circle. The less they know about each other, the better. That way, if one gets caught, the rest are still protected. And if all that wasn't bad enough, the guy they put in charge of this whole caper turned out to be a double agent. Avram Seidenberg was a man of many names and many secrets. To his friends and bosses in Israel, he was Avri Elad. To the spy network, he was Robert. And to the Egyptians, he was Paul Frank, a German businessman who shamelessly enjoyed all the luxuries Cairo had to offer. In hindsight, it's hard to understand why anyone would have trusted Elad to walk their dog, let alone oversee a covert mission behind enemy lines. His entire career was, to use a technical term, one big dumpster fire. He claimed an impressive military career, but he'd been dismissed from nearly every post for stealing, lying, and selling military supplies on the black market. But Israel's director of military intelligence, Benjamin Givli, believed that reformed criminals made the best agents. Elad's superiors were convinced he'd do anything to regain the honor he'd destroyed. So after a stern talking to about the do's and don'ts of proper spycraft, like stop picking up random women by telling them you're on a secret mission for Israeli intelligence. Yeah, he did that. They sent him to Cairo, where he immediately got busy breaking every rule his handlers had established. Instead of keeping a low profile as instructed, Paul Frank showed up at every high society event in a flashy, expensive, and memorable car which he had purchased with Israel's limited funds. When he grew bored of the drab cover story his handlers had concocted, he simply made up a new one, full of dramatic and self-important details that were extremely easy to debunk. The Egyptian authorities sniffed him out almost immediately. Robert's spy ring never had a chance. They had no idea they were about to walk into a trap that would claim 4 lives, bring down a government, and shake Israel's foundations. That their mission would become known in Israel as the rotten business, a euphemism for failure and corruption. It's never a good idea to commit treason. It's especially stupid to do so in an autocratic country. Some of the people who disappeared into Nasser's jails never came out again. Others came back, different, quiet, broken. So why would young Egyptian Jews risk everything to sabotage their country? Well, to put it simply, they didn't see Egypt as their country at all. In the eyes of the state, most Jews were foreigners. Only a handful had Egyptian citizenship, which meant that even the native-born Jews were either stateless or considered foreign subjects. Most of the spy ring felt that Egypt had turned its back on them well before they had turned their backs on it, and they had no intention of staying in Egypt long-term. Most planned to move to Israel as soon as their mission was complete. For decades, Egypt's Jews enjoyed a kind of benign neglect, living segregated but relatively comfortable lives in self-contained communities. They had their own schools, their own doctors, their own sports leagues, even their own language, a Jewish dialect of Arabic written in Hebrew letters, though they mostly spoke French in their day-to-day lives. Outside of work, most Jews had little interaction with their Egyptian Muslim neighbors. No one cared if they went to synagogue instead of mosque, if they studied in a Jewish school, if they attended a Zionist congress, or even raised money for the pioneers building a Jewish homeland in Palestine. At least, not at first. But as the Zionist dream inched closer to becoming a reality in the 30s and 40s, Egypt's Jews began to understand that there were limits to their neighbors' tolerance, hard limits, and the increasing clashes between Arabs and Jews in Palestine translated to persecution of Egyptian Jews at home. In 1945, the Jewish communities of Cairo and Alexandria were rocked by 2 days of looting, vandalism, and worse. Synagogues burned, hundreds were injured, and 5 Jews lost their lives before the police could restore order. Within days of the pogrom, Islamist newspapers began to publish anti-Jewish articles that were virtually indistinguishable from Nazi propaganda. This was no coincidence. Nazism had found a significant foothold in the Arab world, enchanting Egyptian political parties like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Green Shirts. The riot had been the work of Islamists and extremists. It hadn't come from the top, but the Company Law of 1947 did. This reform was framed as a way to improve circumstances for Egyptian citizens by mandating that 90% of all businesses' employees must be Egyptians. In practice, this law squeezed non-citizens out of public life. Thousands of Jews and other foreigners lost their jobs overnight and were unable to find another. But that was nothing compared to what came next. When Egypt invaded the newborn state of Israel in May of 1948, Egyptian police arrested hundreds of Jews suspected of Zionist activity, keeping an uncomfortably close eye on the rest of the community. The Jewish sports clubs were shut down. Places where they had once socialized now bore a prominent sign: Jews not desirable. Worst of all, suspicious explosions began to rock Cairo's Jewish neighborhoods, costing dozens of lives. By the time Nasser became president in 1954, half of Egypt's Jewish population had fled the country. Pogroms, hostility, and punishing economic laws had strangled any hope of a normal life. Jews streamed out of Egypt in the tens of thousands, many forced to leave their assets behind to start from scratch in the tiny Jewish state next door. Things were getting dicey for Egyptian Jews. The cell's plan, codenamed Operation Susanna, was about to make everything much, much worse. No one has more conviction or energy than a young idealist, and the members of the spy ring were no exception. Most were under 25, and they were starstruck by the Israeli emissaries who secretly made their way to Egypt. They truly believed they were helping their brothers and sisters in Israel, and they thought they had the power of the Jewish state behind them, that the country that they loved, prayed towards, and dreamed about would protect them and honor their contributions. Plus, no one was supposed to get hurt. Yes, the plan involved controlled detonations in public spaces frequented by Westerners, but only if they were empty. And the goal wasn't to hurt anyone. It was to create the impression that Egypt was weak and unstable, so that the Brits would stay. The first target was the Alexandria post office, smack in the center of the city. This was by design. The more people around, the harder it would be for the government to censor or suppress the news of an explosion. The spies wanted to get people talking, wondering, questioning whether their country was about to fall apart. Minutes before the post office closed at noon, the Alexandria cell dropped off its packages, which contained incendiary devices programmed to detonate later that day. When they walked by an hour later, the street was cordoned off and swarming with police. The devices had detonated in the empty post office, causing almost no damage. The spies returned home glowing. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. And they were absolutely amped for their next operation. This one had two targets: the American cultural centers in Cairo and Alexandria. As before, no one was meant to get hurt. Once again, the plot went off without a hitch, and the spies were elated. True, only one Alexandrian newspaper reported anything, and it blamed the fire on a short circuit. But still, the plan was working. It was time for the grand finale, which targeted 5 locations: 4 Western-owned cinemas and the railway station. Targets chosen not for their strategic value, but for what they represented. Neither the Muslim Brotherhood nor the communists were happy about all these cinemas showing Western films in their country. Of course, the police would suspect them first. So the agents split up, each targeting a different location. Then, everything fell apart. As Philip Nathanson waited in line to buy his ticket to the movies, he felt a flash of heat. His pants were on fire. The tiny incendiary device he had intended to leave in the cinema bathroom had gone off. For a second, he was utterly oblivious to everything but the burns on his lower body. And then the world came apart around him as Egyptian police hauled him to his feet. "We're onto you," they said, "and we know you were behind other blasts too." His first interrogation took place in the hospital. Despite his untreated injuries, the beatings, and the police's threats against his family, he maintained his innocence. "Get me a lawyer," he shouted again and again. "How dare you treat an injured man like this?" He just hoped that his partners had managed to get away. But within days of his arrest, he came face to face with 2 of his co-conspirators at the police station. Together, they did everything they could to convince the police they were communists, wreaking havoc in Egypt to get the British to leave. It was quick thinking, and local police even commended them for their patriotism, because the average Egyptian really didn't want the British around. But it wasn't the local police the spies had to worry about. The double agent wasn't working for the Alexandria Police Department. He was working for the Egyptian intelligence services. So for a week, the three young men sat in a detention center, hoping they'd gotten away with it. The other members of the Alexandria cell were anxious and terrified, each planning to leave Egypt when they could. But their handler, Robert, assured them that everything would be okay. He was lying, and not just to his agents. As the spy ring was being rounded up, Robert slipped back into Israel, pretending that the Egyptians were on his trail. Some of his handlers were suspicious, but what could they do? By that point, the entire ring had been caught, including an Israeli spy posing as a German. Well before Robert showed up, an Israeli operative named Max Binet had coordinated some of the cell's activities, though he had nothing to do with the actual attacks. But that didn't matter. He was an Israeli citizen and IDF veteran, which meant he had very little chance of escaping with his life. It was over for the Alexandrian cell. Between the merciless beatings and burnings and threats, they confessed everything, except for the existence of the Cairo cell. But of course, Robert had betrayed the Cairo cell too, and they were soon rounded up and cruelly interrogated. After a ruthless beating that left her unable to walk for days, Marcel Nino, the only woman in the cell, tried to fling herself from a window. But Marcel survived to stand trial that December. Her housemate was not so lucky. Marcel's family was not well off, and they took in lodgers to make ends meet. One of these lodgers was a middle-aged dad named Yosef Carmona, whose grown daughter had just moved to Israel. Yosef had no idea that Marcel was working for the state of Israel, but the police were convinced he was in on it too. Later, the neighbors would report that they heard screams coming from the apartment the night the police showed up. The next morning, Yosef Carmona's body was found hanging in the bathroom. The autopsy showed that Yosef had passed away before his hanging. The rotten business had claimed its first victim. Soon, it would claim 3 more. The saboteurs did not expect real justice from the Egyptian court, and they didn't get it. The outcome was predetermined, a compromise between the different factions of the Egyptian government. Hardcore Egyptian nationalists wanted every single one of the spies executed, but the moderates in government were thinking about public diplomacy. They knew it wouldn't play well if the Egyptian government hanged nearly a dozen Jews, especially not at this delicate time with the Brits about to leave. So they urged a softer approach. Eventually, the two sides came to an agreement. So when the judge walked into the courtroom on the first day of the trial, he knew exactly what his verdict would be. The defendants, however, knew nothing. Most of the time, they had no idea what was going on in the courtroom. The majority only spoke Judeo-Arabic or French, and they didn't understand the formal language of the legal proceedings. Confused and helpless, they watched the Egyptian authorities decide the course of their lives and prayed for the Jewish state to intervene somehow. At the very least, they hoped for some guidance on how to behave, what to say, how to conduct themselves. A word of encouragement? But they didn't get it. Publicly, Israel had disassociated itself completely from the young spies. Behind the scenes, the head of Israeli military intelligence appealed to as many European powers as he could. Some of the defendants had European citizenship, and he hoped that at the very least, the Germans and the French could persuade the Egyptians to be lenient. But the appeals went nowhere, and the spies had no idea that the head of military intelligence was calling in every favor he could. All they knew was that they were terrified and utterly alone. They had endangered their families. They had potentially cut short their own lives. And now, if they were lucky, they would be sent to Egypt's infamous prisons to be mercilessly abused for years. The state of Israel would eventually admit that the group's oldest member, Max, had been an Israeli spy. Max knew the prosecution would try to pin the whole plan on him. They knew he was Israeli. They knew he had served in the IDF. And he was the cell's resident elder, a married father in his mid-30s. He couldn't pretend this was some idealistic, youthful misadventure. But he also refused to say anything that might incriminate other members of the cell. He had tried several times to take his own life in prison. The night before he was supposed to testify, he finally succeeded. The failed mission had claimed its second life. The trial wrapped up quickly, but it took nearly a month for the remaining defendants to learn their sentences, wavering between hope and despair. After all, they hadn't hurt anyone. They'd barely even damaged any property. Most weren't even Egyptian citizens. Their country had rejected them long before they rejected it. And surely the world was watching. Surely the Egyptians didn't want to appear too rash, too extreme. But Nasser's justice system was taking the lives of Muslim brothers in droves. And it would look terrible if these Zionist spies were given mercy when real Egyptians were denied it, even if they hadn't actually hurt anyone, unlike the Muslim brothers. As the judges read out the sentences, Each word landed like a physical blow. 2 were hanged, though neither one had actually been involved with the explosions at the cinemas or the library. 6 were sent to jail, with sentences ranging from 7 years to life. The final 2 were acquitted. All the while, the Egyptian papers were having a field day. Every salacious detail showed up in the press, whether or not it was actually true. And yet, the Israeli papers were curiously tight-lipped, leaving Israeli citizens desperate for information. All they knew was that something bad was happening in Egypt, that 2 Jews had been hanged in a Cairo prison, accused of spying for Israel. All over the country, Israeli citizens went into mourning. When the grief subsided, they wanted answers. Who had authorized this dangerous operation? And why had it all gone so wrong? But from the start, Israeli authorities were more interested in pointing fingers at each other than taking responsibility. No one wanted to be held accountable for this embarrassing failure. Of course, the most obvious person to blame was the head of military intelligence, Benjamin Givli. He had authorized the creation of both cells. He had approved sending Avram Seidenberg, aka Avri Elad, aka Robert, aka Paul Frank, aka the man we now know to be a double agent, to act as the cell's handler. But when he was questioned about his role, Givli found someone more powerful to blame: the Israeli defense minister, Pinchas Lavon. Givli insisted that Lavon had authorized the mission, but Lavon denied any knowledge of the operation. It was one man's word against the others, and even the official investigative committees couldn't figure out who was telling the truth. Then, Givli pulled out his trump cards. He had meeting notes that proved Lavon knew about the operation. He even had Lavon's instructions in writing. It didn't matter how much Lavon protested that he knew nothing. Here was proof that the defense minister had authorized the operation, that the rotten business was his fault. And so in February of 1955, Lavon resigned in disgrace, still maintaining he knew nothing about the operation. Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, came out of retirement to fill in as Minister of Defense. Shortly after, Givli resigned too. And perhaps that should have been the end of the story. But Lavon wouldn't let the matter rest. He pleaded for a new inquiry to reopen the investigation. In 1960, he got his wish. And when the new committee examined the evidence, they uncovered a bombshell. Givli had forged the incriminating documents, and Ben-Gurion, who had since become prime minister, did not care. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion refused to accept the committee's findings, insisting that no matter what Givli had done, the responsibility lay with Lavon. He urged a new inquiry, this one spearheaded not by the government, but by the courts. But his party refused. The whole affair was embarrassing, and the government had spent enough time and resources relitigating a moment everyone preferred to forget. So Ben-Gurion lived the rest of his life convinced that Lavon was the bad guy in this story. That even if Givli had forged the evidence, well, that was nothing compared to Lavon's crimes. But why? Why was the Israeli prime minister so insistent that the forgeries didn't matter? True, Lavon was a political rival, but that doesn't explain why Ben-Gurion was so willing to pin the whole rotten business on him. After all, politics is full of ugliness and rivalries. So why the animus against Lavon? To understand that, you have to know one thing. The Israel Defense Forces were Ben-Gurion's baby. He had commanded the army back when it was a hard-scrabble, scrappy militia known as the Haganah. And in his eyes, the IDF could do no wrong. So it was far easier for him to accept that his rival Lavon had messed up than to consider that the IDF he so loved could fall prey to such deep corruption so soon after its founding. And so until the day he left this earth, Ben-Gurion insisted the fault could not lie with the IDF. Because if it did, that would mean the army he had built from scratch was as corruptible as any other institution. Sometimes, we see what we wish to see. Sometimes, the truth hurts too much to admit. But the scandal didn't end there. Avri Elad, the double agent, escaped justice. When he returned from Egypt in 1954, Israeli intelligence debriefed him repeatedly, looking for clues. Each time his story changed slightly. But despite their vocal suspicions, no one could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was a double agent who betrayed the cell. And so, the head of Israeli military intelligence, Givli, sent him on another mission, this one in West Germany. Some in the intelligence establishment suspected that Givli was trying to get Elad out of the country so that the investigative committee couldn't ask him more questions. Why else would Givli keep using him as an agent? Whatever the reason for Givli's horrible decision-making, even he was eventually forced to admit that Elad was a traitor. Because while in West Germany, Elad offered to sell state secrets to the Egyptian military attaché. The jig was finally up. Avri Elad served 10 years in prison on charges of unauthorized contact with the enemy. He never faced justice for his role in the rotten business of 1954, never paid for the lives he destroyed, never apologized for betraying his agents or his country. But the rotten business wasn't over yet. There was still one more shocking revelation to unearth. By the early 60s, 2 of the spies had served their sentences and come to Israel, where they were prohibited from talking to the press. But 4 more spies were still rotting in Egyptian prisons. They were finally released in a prisoner exchange following the 1967 Six-Day War. And when they finally went public in 1975, they had a shocking message for the Israeli people. They claimed the Israeli government could have freed them 12 years earlier in 1956, saving them from more than a decade of abuse. Because 2 years after they'd gone to prison, Israel and Egypt fought a war in the Sinai that left Israel with hundreds of POWs to use as bargaining chips. But they didn't use them to free the spies. Instead, they traded over 5,000 Egyptian soldiers for a single Israeli pilot and 3 other soldiers. For 2 years, the Israeli establishment had tried desperately to cover up its mistakes, to make everyone forget about the rotten business of 1954. Bringing the spies home in 56 would have reopened the whole affair, exposing the Israeli establishment to scrutiny it really didn't need or want. There is no happy ending to this story. It's a story of betrayal, of shattered innocence, of ordinary people paying a terrible price for the lies of the powerful. For many Israelis, the Lavon Affair serves as a warning, a cautionary tale of what happens when political interests are put in front of human lives.